Hello, and welcome to the Newport MFA June residency, done remotely. I'm sorry that we can't all be together, but one of the ways that I thought I might contribute this time around is to give you like a short talk, maybe 20 minutes, about something I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is escapist fiction and the importance of escapist fiction in this time of pandemic and in general for us as human beings. But before I do that, I wanted to give you a little tour of my writing space. I won't be able to do this at the residency because I don't have Wi-Fi out here. So I'll just give you a little tour just so you can see my writing space. So here it is. I'm hoping that you can see it okay. I'm holding my computer in such a way that hopefully you're getting some idea. I have a little sitting area, which is nice for reading and, reading, student submissions and other things. Here's my little corner, which I call the succulent hospital. I'm taking care of the succulents. And this is my space where I do work that is not related to writing. Things like, all kinds of things that isn't related to writing. And bookshelves. And then over here, you can see a little bit of the house, our house over there, and my standing desk. This is where I work. And you can see a little bit of the view I have out my window, which is pretty nice. We have this new place in Vermont, and one of the wonderful things about it is that we have this expansive view and all kinds of good trails and birds and deer and turkey running by. But one of the deals with this new house was that I would get this writing space, which is pretty nice. It's actually it was unfinished when we got here. It's the upstairs apartment or the upstairs room of a garage that's separate from the house, and so it's a pretty sweet space. But I wanted to show you this shelf. You may not be able to read the actual titles, but these are sort of some of the books that have been important to me in my development as a writer. The top shelf is Shakespeare, all of Shakespeare plays at Yale Shakespeare, and then some, not all, but some of the books that have been really influential in my development as a writer. If you've worked with me, you may recognize some of these. And you also could notice that maybe that these are kind of a mix of literary and what we might call escapist books. So anyway, this is the space, and I'm going to take you back over to my writing desk and talk a little bit about escapist fiction. So lately, I've been trying not to think so much about the cultural moment, not to let it look over my shoulder so much, especially as I'm writing. What I mean by the cultural moment is just the zeitgeist, the daily news headlines, social media, popular culture, all the stuff that unites us in a way as a culture, but also that creates a form of cultural homogenization that I think can sometimes militate against good writing. We live in an age of online media. We imbibe it constantly through our laptops and smartphones and large screen TVs. And the internet has its uses, economic, social, political, but at its best, it only gives us a pale and watered down version of the human experience. And it has really, these days, reached into every corner of our lives, threatening to homogenize diverse human societies into a global mega culture of generic pop commercialism. And I'm not saying that great literature isn't influenced by the culture in which it's created. Of course it is. It's just that as a novelist and a reader, it seems to me that the most enduring books the ones that remain in my personal canon, were created by writers who found a way to transcend the societal preoccupations of the moment, to create works of narrative that were capable of speaking to human beings across the generations. So a stronger version of the human experience than we're getting right now online might involve face-to-face contact with actual human beings. But as you know, our mandatory isolation these days can make that sort of contact problematic. But we do still have access to other aspects of what we might call real human experience. Anyone, if you've taken a class with me, you know that I often quote Carl Jung, Dr. Carl Jung. And one of the things that Jung wrote was, because I think he's really important, he's someone who writers can really learn a lot from. But one of the things he wrote is this. He said, individual consciousness is only the flower and the fruit of a season, sprung from the perennial rhizome beneath the earth. I'll just read this one more time. Individual consciousness is only the flower and the fruit of a season, sprung from the perennial rhizome beneath the earth. So what he's saying is that we're all mushrooms. We're all just mushrooms that are sprouting from this underground network that connects us. Do you see this? I mean, how does it feel to be a mushroom? Yeah. Anyway, I feel pretty good. I like mushrooms. But anyway, as a writer, what I take from Jung's metaphor of the underground network that connects us is that if you want something you've created to resonate with other human beings, the place to look is not where you might think. It's not outside yourself, but deep within. I'm lucky enough, as I showed you, to live in a place that has easy access to nature. There's a forest trail not too far away that I can run or hike or collect mushrooms. I can get my hands dirty in the garden. I can go visit a local stream with a fly rod. Often I receive ideas and insights about various writing programs when I'm doing this kind of thing outside, but mostly I try not to think, to simply be. I know there's a word for this, mindfulness, and yet for my own purposes, I prefer to think of it as mindlessness, because like many writers, I imagine, I often find myself stuck within my thoughts, and my goal is to get out. So something else that many of you know about me is that as part of my parallel career in international education, I have for many years been traveling to Cuba. We have a residency in Cuba. I hope you'll go once that becomes possible again, because it's pretty cool. Anyway, my last trip was with the Newport residency in January 2020, which now feels like 100 years ago. The island, though, of Cuba has in a sense been trapped in its own historical moment ever since January of 1959. And through no fault of their own, that moment has been difficult for the Cuban people to transcend. In Havana, you tend to see a lot of live music and dance. And the thing I've always found most striking or interesting about it, besides just how amazingly good it is the look of pure transportation on the faces of the artists whenever the rehearsal or the performance gets underway. And this brings me to a word that might strike you as a little funny or exaggerated at first, ecstasy. And I'm not talking about the drug ecstasy, though drugs can be an effective way of getting you out of your head, but that's for another talk. What I mean is the temporary state of being described by the word ecstasy, which is rooted in the ancient Greek ekstasis, which means to be or stand outside of oneself, a removal to elsewhere, as in a dream or a trance. To be or stand outside of oneself, a removal to elsewhere, as in a dream or a trance. And this does actually remind me of drugs, especially hallucinogenic drugs. But my Cuban friends can achieve their transcendence, their ecstatic trance or dream, without the help of any ingested chemical. Instead, they rely on total immersion in the mastery of their art, which they practice intensively for hours at a time, 6 or 7 days a week often. So the ecstasy of losing yourself in your craft isn't limited to Cuba, of course, nor is it limited to performance artists. You can see it in all kinds of people who take pride in their work, from carpenters to athletes to chefs. Ecstasy is that feeling of losing yourself in something, of being in the zone. And for the millions of human beings who now find themselves spending most of their time trapped indoors and or inside a narrow headspace, this kind of ecstasy may well be an essential concept. Okay. So novel writing is another form of work that requires a sustained daily practice. Scribbling or writing on a laptop is less directly physical than dance or carpentry, but the ability to transport is a defining characteristic of fiction as an art form. And I am talking about fiction here, but this can also go to memoir. I'm only talking about fiction because it is it's the form of writing that I'm the most immersed in. Part of the goal of the novelist, in other words, is, so I said the ability to transport is a defining characteristic of fiction as an art form. And part of the goal of the novelist is to choose vivid sensory detail to stun the mind of the willing reader into becoming immersed in the fictional trance or dreams. In other words, part of our goal as fiction writers is to launch the willing reader into a state of ecstatic transportation. So all successful fiction needs to be immersive, but to me it can be seen most clearly in what we might call escapist fiction. And we'll talk in a minute about what I mean by that. But for now, escapist fiction is the kind of fiction where one of the main goals is to get both the reader and the writer as far out of their heads as possible. J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, is a good example of a novelist who used ecstatic techniques to dislodge readers from the grip of their own cultural moment and into his story world over the course of two magnificent quest narratives, The Hobbit, which was published in 1937, and The Lord of the Rings, which was published in 1954. And I think it's important to notice or to remember that Tolkien was, among other things, a very talented nature writer. The incredible landscapes of Middle-earth, which are incredible, were very immersive. And they're no doubt rooted partly in the author's life experience, his long habit of immersing himself in real-world nature, from the wildernesses of his childhood in South Africa to treks through the Alps as he recovered from the traumas of World War I. He was a soldier in World War I, and most of his friends were killed. And to the daily walks that he used to take among the ancient trees lining the River Cherwell in Oxford. Tolkien's descriptions, though, are not pretty postcards copied out from a travel journal, but ecstatic living dreamscapes. I want to read you a quick sample from The Lord of the Rings. This is just you could basically open the books and pick out anything because there's just so much description in it that kind of fits this category. But this is kind of a random one. Okay. All day, far below them, a leaping stream had run down from the high pass behind, cleaving its narrow way between pine-clad walls, and now through a stony gate it flowed out and passed into a wider vale. The riders followed it, and suddenly Harrowdale lay before them, loud with the noise of waters in the evening. There the white Snowbourn, joined by the lesser stream, went rushing, fuming on the stones, down to Edoras and the green hills and the plains. Away to the right at the head of the great dale, the mighty Starkhorn loomed up above its vast buttresses swathed in cloud. But its jagged peak, clothed in everlasting snow, gleamed far above the world, blue-shadowed upon the east, red-stained by the sunset in the west. So this kind of description is the essence of what I mean when I talk about ecstatic fiction, because what this description and others like it is doing is sort of harnessing the deep-seated tendency of the human imagination to go about constructing whatever imagery is suggested to it. You know, human beings are imaginative creatures. It's one of the things that maybe sets us apart as a species, is that we have this tendency, first of all, we're storytellers, but we have this tendency when we're presented with with vivid, concrete details, our imagination we can't help. Our imagination is kind of unconsciously or automatically goes about constructing that picture in our minds. And so when your mind starts scrolling this kind of vivid imagery, you tend to forget yourself. You have entered the dream state of the novel. You have the little black marks on the white page. You're no longer seeing those little black marks that are words. You're actually living through this colorful, continuous dream of the fiction. So you are intensively present in the story world. You're following the characters as they experience whatever dangers and wonders or whatever it is that awaits them. And so this is pretty cool. And I think this is ecstatic fiction, and I'm saying it's also really escapist fiction. And I think that the same kind of thing can be said about more recent novels too, of course. So I want to read you one of my favorite passages from a book that you've definitely heard me use before, which is Madeline Miller's 2018 masterpiece, Circe. The mist came first. It closed in wet and heavy, obscuring the cliffs, then the sky itself. We could see little, and the sound of the sucking whirlpool filled our ears. That whirlpool was, of course, the reason Scylla had chosen these straits. To avoid its pull, ships must steer close to the opposite cliff. It brought them right beneath her teeth. We pushed on through the thick air. As we entered the straits, the sound grew hollowed, echoing off the stone walls. My skin, the deck, the rail, every surface was thick with spray. The water foamed, and an oar scraped the rock face. A small sound, but the men flinched as if it were a thunderclap. Above us, buried in the fog, was the cave and Scylla. Or one more description from that book. This is Miller's description of the mythical palace of Knossos. Before us, the huge limestone stairs wavered in the heat. Men streamed past us, servants and nobles alike, their shoulders sun-darkened and bare. Above, the palace of mighty Knossos glowed on its hill like a hive. Or here's one more description. This is from Essie Edugian's Washington Black, which was also published in 2018. I paused in the brisk sea air. At the water's edge, a small rowboat lay tilted deep in the sand, and I watched from a distance as two figures lumbered awkwardly with it, the woman attempting to guide the oars with a bandaged hand, while the other pushed against its side, trying to right it. Behind them, the sea heaved in bright waves, the foam white and radiant. So when you read passages like this, you see that it's not just a vividly described setting, but a point of view character's emotionally slanted experience of that setting that allows for the ecstatic leap that I've been talking about, that launches the reader into the immersive dream of the story. And I guess my main point here is that this kind of thing is what escapist fiction does best. And now I should make it clear that when I say escapist, I don't mean light reading. All three of the novels I just quoted are actually pretty dark in tone and subject matter. Tolkien was a soldier in World War I, as I mentioned, and he wrote most of his fiction during a period that spanned the rise of Nazism and the first use of the atomic bomb. Lord of the Rings is a frightening story about evil taking over the world and the corrupting nature of absolute power. Madeline Miller's book, Circe, is a contemporary feminist revision of a myth that is one of the keystones of patriarchal Western culture. And Essie Edugian's Washington Black is a thrilling adventure story that also explores the indelible stain of slavery and the way that well-meaning whites can become racism's most effective enablers. But if you're still tempted to look askance at escapist fiction in general, it's worth listening to Neil Gaiman, who was paraphrasing Tolkien when he said, "There's only one class of people who don't like escape, and that's jailers." So if you're still wondering what I mean by escapist fiction, I'm not talking about a particular publishing genre. It can be sci-fi, fantasy, historical, it can even be mainstream literary, as long as the setting is different from the one that we encounter in our daily lives. And in some ways, the more different, the better. Because what the best escapist novels offer us is the chance to rise above the dreary homogeneity of being stuck in the current cultural moment. In other words, no matter how they're characterized in terms of publishing genre, they offer us a trance-like reading experience that is deeper, more universal, more timeless, more resonant, more myth-like. Escapist stories are ecstatic stories, which is just another way of saying that they're stories with deep connections to that underground network of Carl Jung's of the collective unconscious. You know them when you read them. The daily practice of writing is a psychological necessity for me. On good days, I can lose myself completely in the story. It feels a bit like method acting sometimes, although slower, with frequent stops and starts to check a word, fix a sentence, take a look back, or jot a few notes about where the characters are telling me they want to go next. But what novel writing lacks in intensity, it makes up for in duration. For months or even years, if things are going well, the world of my novel in progress is somewhere I can go multiple times a day. Novel reading, on the other hand, doesn't take nearly so long. And as a result, when things go well, the reading experience can be even more immersive than the writing experience. But the unique value of fiction, in my opinion, is that it provides a matrix for empathy, like a mind meld or a kind of interface that connects two human beings across otherwise insurmountable gaps in time and space. Because the truth is that no matter how many people surround us, as human beings, we're always alone. And fiction, or narrative prose in general, if you want, gives us a way to experience life from inside the consciousness of another person, which is the reason that novels and memoirs are things that people really crave, because it's rare to be able to get out of our own minds and into the mind of someone else. This is really the only way that we can do it. And this is also, because it does give us this interface with another human consciousness, this is also why books are such a powerful antidote to loneliness. Escapist fiction has a unique kind of immersiveness, which also allows it to illuminate the hidden abilities of the human mind, including, as I think we saw in some of the passages I read you, the ability to remember our connection to the physical world and the natural systems that sustain us. Not just the material world of nature and trees and mountains and rivers and the ocean, but also the radiant energy dwelling behind that material world. This special power of escapist fiction strikes me as more important than ever right now, when the narrow bandwidth consciousness of electronic media and online culture can easily become a trap. Freeing ourselves from that kind of trap can be difficult, sometimes nearly impossible. But I really think it's a centrally important struggle for every one of us at this point in the history of the human species. In the end, it is a battle that will be fought not as a society, but one individual at a time. And maybe some of the best weapons we have to fight that battle are ecstatic practices like getting outside, engaging in work that truly absorbs us, and giving ourselves permission, at least occasionally, to get lost in an escapist novel. So that's all I have. I do have a written version of this, by the way. If anyone wants it, just email me and I'll send it to you. And I look forward to seeing more of you as the residency goes on. Meanwhile, good luck, stay safe, and sending good writing karma your way.